class will be in session. Mr. Cook and Ms. Caballero and Ms. Yamada notice the absence of a quorum, and Mr. Block notices the absence of a quorum. Will the sergeants please contact the absent members, prepare the chambers. Clerk, please call the roll.
Adams, Amiano, Anderson, Arambula, Bell, Bill Berryhill, Tom Berryhill, Blakesley, Block, Blumenfield, Brownlee, Buchanan, Caballero, Calderon, Carter, Chesbro, Conway, Cook, Cotto, Davis, De La Torre, De Leon, DeVore, Duval, Emerson, Ing, Evans, Fior, Fletcher, Fong, Fuentes, Fuller, Furutani, Gaines, Galgiani, Garrick, Gilmore, Hagman, Hall, Harkey, Hayashi, Hernandez, Hill, Huber, Huffman, Jeffries, Jones, Knight, Krikorian, Liu, Logue, Lowenthal, Ma, Mendoza, Miller, Monning, Nava, Nastande, Nilo, Nilsson, John A. Perez, V. Manuel Perez, Portantino, Ruskin, Solis, Saldana, Silva, Skinner, Smythe, Solorio, Strickland, Swanson, Torlixon, Torres, Tarico, Tran, Belines, Yamada. Madam Speaker.
Members, a quorum is present. I'd like to ask our guests and visitors in the gallery in the rear of chambers to please stand. We'll ask Assembly Chaplain Father Constantine Papadimos to lead us in this morning's prayer.
Let us pray. Lord, you have told us to love one another. Love is a fruit of the Spirit that is in season at all times and within reach of every hand. Anyone may gather it and no limit is set. Lord, show us how to reach this love through quiet meditation, the spirit of prayer and sacrifice, and by an intense inner life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Please remain standing. Today's pledge will be led by Mr. Gilmore.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Father.
We'll move on to reading of
Assembly Chamber, Sacramento, Thursday, July 2nd, 2009. The Assembly met at 9:30 a.m. Honorable Alberto Chirico, Assembly Member 20 District, presiding. Chief Clerk D. Dustin Wilson at the desk. Assistant Clerk Timothy Moreland Reed. And the roll was called. Assembly Member Cook moved to quorum of the call of the Assembly.
Mr. De Leon moves. Mr. Gaines seconds. Reading of the previous day's journal will be dispensed with. There are no presentation of petitions. Introduction and reference of bills will be deferred. Reports of committees will be deemed read. Amendments deemed adopted. Messages from the Governor, there are none. Messages from the Senate, there are none. We move on now to motions and resolutions. We have one illness today, Mr. Anderson, on legislative business. Motions and resolutions, Mr. Torrico.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good afternoon. I request unanimous consent to allow Assembly Member Garrick to personally adjourn in memory of an individual today.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to refer SB 832 from the Senate Environmental Quality Committee to Natural Resources Committee, and then to the Revenue Tax Committee, and then back to Natural Resource Committee.
Without objection.
Speaker, I request unanimous consent to waive the file notice requirements to allow the Public Safety Committee to hear SB 774 by Senator Ashburn on Tuesday, July 7th at 9 a.m.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, at the request of the authors, please remove the following bills from the consent calendar. File item 46, SB 589, Senator Harman. File item 142, SB 192, Senator Negrete McLeod.
Without objection, clerk will note.
Madam Speaker, at the request of the author, please remove file item 141, SB 131 by Senator Wiggins from the consent calendar and then place it on the inactive file.
Clerk will note.
Madam Speaker, at the request of the author, please return file item 61, AB 688 by Mr. Ng to the Senate for further action.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, at the request, I request unanimous consent to waive the file notice requirements to allow the Utilities and Commerce Committee to hear SB 14 by Senator Smithian today, Monday, July 6th at 3 p.m.
Without objection.
No, there is an objection for that, Madam Speaker.
Oh, there is an objection, Mr. Gaines?
Yeah, Madam Speaker, we oppose this motion and respectfully request a roll call vote.
And this is on SB 14?
Yes.
Members, Mr. Gaines is asking for a roll call vote to waive a file notice requirement and allow a bill to be heard later today. Mr. Torrico is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gaines is asking for a no vote. I know members are still in the process of arriving. So members who are just entering the chamber, we're about to take up a procedural vote. right, members, if you'll please ensure that your keys are in, we are going to do a procedural vote.
Move a call on that one, and then just keep things going.
Okay. So once again, on the consent to waive the file notice requirements, Mr. Torrico is asking for an aye vote, Mr. Gaines for a no vote. Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Torrico is asking for an aye vote, Mr. Blakesley, or rather Mr. Gaines for a no vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Torrico moves a call. We'll continue with motions and resolutions. Mr. Torrico? Okay. Members, we'll continue now with business on the daily file. We can go on to second reading. Clerk will read.
Senate Bill 520, 209, 132 with amendments, 418, 774 with amendments, 535 with amendments, 19, 135 with amendments, 173 with amendments, 279 with amendments, 5, 130, 159, 215, 257, 286, 288, 309, 325,
All remaining
327.
bills will be deemed read, amendments deemed adopted. We go on now to concurrence. Mr. Torrico?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. If we could return to motion and resolutions for a moment, please. At the request of the author, please send file item 11 SB5 to the inactive file.
File item 11 SB5. Clerk will note. Mr. Torrico.
Madam Speaker, under motions of resolutions, I request unanimous consent to waive the file notice requirements to allow the Appropriations Committee to hear AB 1318 by Assembly Member Manuel Perez on Wednesday, July 8, 2009 at 9 a.m.
Mr. Gaines? Without objection, clerk will note.
Huffman said, cross his people off. They're not.
All right, members, we're continuing on the daily file. We have several items that are eligible on concurrence. beginning with file item 57. And I don't see the bill manager on the floor. One moment, Ms. Torres. I was just alerted that we have a former colleague joining us today, Representative Sam Farr from Congressional District 17. Mr. Farr, welcome to the chamber. Welcome back. Now, Ms. Torres, if you'll please allow the clerk to read. Members, we are taking up our first item of business. File item 57, clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 22 by Assemblymember Torres, an act relating to computer hacking.
You may open, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Madam Speaker and members. Assembly Bill 22 is the computer hacking and related identity theft are crimes that often have a motive of financial gain. By increasing the maximum fine that a judge may impose on a hacker, Assembly Bill 22 is intended to provide a more substantial deterrent to commission of these types of crimes without imposing on the state the increased costs associated with longer terms of incarceration. AB 22 increases the maximum fine of $10,000 to $12,000 for each computer hacking offense. When broadcasting company CBS became the victim of a computer hacking, it took their people 10 days working around the clock to track hackers. This bill makes no change in the definition of computer hacking crimes, terms of jail or prison, and no change in the assessment of what constitutes a more severe offense. It simply makes a conviction potentially more expensive for the offender.
Thank you, Ms. Torres. Members, seeing no further discussion or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. 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 Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 62, noes 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. File item 58 is pass and retain. File item 59 by Mr. Knight. Pass and retain. File item 60 by Mr. Silva. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 528 by Assemblymember Silva, an act relating to local government.
You may open, Mr. Silva.
Okay. Madam Speaker and members, AB 528 is supported by the FPPC and the California Association Agency Formation Commission, also known as LAFCO. AB 528 seeks to conform the reporting and disclosure requirements of the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Act with the requirements of the political reform that were chaptered into law in 2008. This measure took technical amendments in the Senate. As of this date, it has received no votes, and I ask for your concurrence.
Seeing no discussion or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 67, noes 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. File item 61 is pass and retain. File item 62 by Mr. Hagman. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1129 by Assemblymember Hagman and others, an act relating to firearms.
You may open, Mr. Hagman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good morning, members. It's my pleasure to present AB 1129. AB 1129 is a good bill that clears up procedural language in the Penal Code. This bill has enjoyed unanimous support in every step of this journey, and I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Seeing no debate or discussion, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 69, noes 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. We move to file item 63. Ms. Caballero will be presenting that. Gentlemen, if you can please Not stand in front of Ms. Caballero. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1582 by the Assembly Committee on Local Government, an act relating to local agencies.
You may open, Ms. Caballero.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker and members. AB 1582 is the Assembly Local Government Committee's annual omnibus bill, which focuses on cleanups of the Cortese-Knox-Hertzberg Local Government Reorganization Act. This year's bill makes 6 changes to the act affecting LAFCOs and local government boundaries and is sponsored by Cal LAFCO. The omnibus bill combines several changes to state law into a single consensus bill, which has been vetted by all of the interested parties. I respectfully request your aye vote on concurrence in the Senate amendments.
Seeing no debate or discussion, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Aye 68, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. File item 64 is passed and retained. File item 65, Ms. Galgiani is prepared to take that up. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 124 by Assemblymember Galgiani and others, an act relating to cemeteries and declaring the urgency thereof to take effect immediately.
You may open, Ms. Galgiani.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. A situation arose in my district at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery where the manager had his license pulled, and thus we've had no operator for the cemetery for over 2.5 years. And we learned that there is nothing in current law that allows for anybody to step in and care for a property once a cemetery manager's license has been revoked. So this will allow for a temporary appointment of a conservator so that the grounds can be taken care of and so that our loved ones can be taken care of with the dignity that they deserve. This bill went through this House last year without opposition. It didn't get to the governor in time, and it got the veto like many of you had on your bills. I ask for your aye vote.
Seeing no debate or discussion, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Aye 66, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. We move to file item 66. Mr. Hagman, clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 430 by Assemblymember Hagman and others, an act relating to corrections.
You may open, Mr. Hagman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. AB 430 is a good district bill that took some minor amendments in the Senate. This bill has enjoyed unanimous support in every step of this journey. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Seeing no debate or discussion, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Aye 68, no 0. We move on to file item 67 by Mr. Hernandez. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 681 by Assemblymember Hernandez, an act relating to confidentiality of medical information.
You may open, Mr. Hernandez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, this bill, AB 681, will allow a healthcare provider to disclose information about a patient's participation in outpatient psychotherapy without requiring a written signed request. This bill is necessary in order for psychotherapists to disclose information in a timelier manner and avoid a potential dangerous situation. Senate amendments were technical, provide clarifying language. There is no known opposition, and I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Seeing no discussion or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Aye 73, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. File item 68 is passed temporarily. File item 69 by Ms. Evans. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 1337 by Assemblymember Evans, an act relating to elections.
You may open, Ms. Evans.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill, members, defines what electioneering is. Although that's a term that's been used in our statutes for many, many years, there is no actual definition. The Secretary of State's office has given advice as to what the term actually means, but there is no definition in law. It would define electioneering as the visible or audible dissemination of information that advocates for or against a candidate or a measure within 100 feet of a polling place. The Senate amendments provide that electioneering includes both the visible display of information and the audible dissemination of information. I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Seeing no discussion or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 72, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. We go on to file item 70. Ms. Carter, clerk will read.
Assembly concur in Resolution 24 by Assemblymember Carter relative to the John Nauenbauer Fifth Street Bridge.
You may open, Ms. Carter.
Madam Speaker, ACR 24 designate the Fifth Street Bridge in San Bernardino as the John Nauenbauer Fifth Street Bridge. The amendment adopted in the Senate was a simple technical change, and it passed the Senate with a vote of 40-0. I respectfully ask for your aye vote on concurrence in Senate amendments.
Amendments, this is a fiscal measure. We need to do a roll call vote. Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 72, no 0. The resolution is adopted. Members, we'll move on to file item 71 by Mr. Gilmore. Clerk will read.
Assembly concur in Resolution 60 by Assemblymember Gilmore relative to the Larry Stanley Pierce Memorial Highway.
You may open, Mr. Gilmore.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, ACR 60 will designate a portion of the State Highway 46 as a Medal of Valor recipient Larry S. Pierce Memorial Highway. The amendments in the Senate were technical and simply corrected a transmitting error or drafting error. I'm sorry. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Very well, members. Even though it's a resolution, it is fiscal. We need a roll call vote. Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll. Tally the votes. Ayes 71, noes 1. The resolution is adopted. Senate amendments are concurred in. Members, we had a procedural vote that went on call. Mr. Torrico is asking that we lift the call. This is regarding waiving file notice requirements. Mr. Torrico is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gaines is asking for a no vote. Clerk, please post the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Torrico is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gaines for a no vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 45, noes 26. The rules are suspended. Waiver is granted. We'll return to file item 68 by Mr. Bell. Clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 706 by the Assembly Committee on Human Services, an act relating to dependent children, and declaring the urgency thereof to take effect immediately.
You may open, Mr. Bell.
Madam Speaker and members, this is a Committee on Human Services bill that makes non-controversial technical changes to address some confusion resulting from last year's AB 2341 in the child welfare laws. It clarifies the timing of court hearings and dependency proceedings and makes other non-substantive technical changes. The Senate amendments make additional clarifying and technical changes which were agreed upon by a stakeholder work group that developed the original language of the bill, and I ask for a aye vote on this measure.
Seeing no discussion or debate, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 74, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. We passed over file item 64 by Mr. Duval. We'll go back to that now. Clerk will read.
Assembly concur in Resolution 43 by Assemblymember Duval and others relative to Motorcycle Awareness Month.
Mr. Duval, you may open.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I would just like to ask for concurrence in the Senate amendments and ask for an aye vote.
Seeing no debate or discussion, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 70, no 0. Senate amendments are concurred in. Members will go on now to the consent calendar for second day. Does any member wish to remove an item? We've already. All right. Seeing and hearing no additional changes, clerk will read.
Assembly Joint Resolution 16 by Assemblymember Evans and others relative to journalism shield laws.
Mr. Torrico.
I apologize, Madam Speaker. Before we take up the consent calendar, I hereby request unanimous consent at the request of the author to please pull file item 139, SB 285 by Senator Wright from the consent calendar.
Clerk will note. All right, members, there was a flag in the play. We're ready now to take the vote. Clerk will open the roll on the consent calendar. All members vote who desire to vote. This is on the consent calendar. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 76, no 0. Consent calendar is adopted.
Senate Bill 633.
Ayes 76, no 0.
And Senate Bill 306.
Ayes 76, no 0. All reconsideration items will be continued. Assembly third reading items will be continued. Mr. Krikorian?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to rescind the action whereby SB 832 was removed from the Natural Resources Committee and re-referred to the Revenue and Taxation Committee and then back to the Natural Resources Committee.
So you've rescinded that. Mr. Gaines? Mr. Gaines, could you repeat that, please?
Could you hold for a minute?
Mr. Krikorian, once again, that was to rescind an action, and there is no objection to that. Very well, clerk will note. You had another item regarding the consent calendar?
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I request unanimous consent to waive the notice requirements to allow the Rules Committee to meet during session today immediately.
Without objection? members, we have some items to take up in fourth extraordinary session, so at this time we'll recess our regular session for purposes of convening fourth extraordinary session. We'll substitute the pledge, roll call, and other procedural items for fourth extraordinary session. Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, before motions and resolutions, in case it wasn't clear, the Rules Committee is meeting right now in the Rules Committee room.
Oh. Very well. Rules Committee meeting off the floor in Rules Committee room.
Madam Speaker, in the fourth extraordinary session, Assembly Bills 1 through 30 are at the Assembly desk. I request unanimous consent to withdraw Assembly Bills 1 through 30 from the desk, to take them up without reference to file for the purpose of second reading today, and to order them to third reading for Tuesday, July 7th. These measures relate to the budget.
Without objection. One moment. I do see an objection. Mr. Nielsen.
Request an abstention with the Republicans, Madam Speaker.
So you'd like a roll call vote, and you're asking your members to abstain on that? Very well. Clerk will open the roll on the motion. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Krikorian is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Nielsen is asking for a no vote. All members vote who desire to vote. I'm sorry, Mr. Nielsen was asking for an abstention, not a no vote. Mr. Nielsen asked for an abstention on behalf of his members. Clerk will close the roll. Tally the votes. Ayes 46, noes 1. The motion carries. Clerk will read the bills a second time.
Assembly.
Clerk will read the bill a second.
Assembly Bill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and Assembly Bill 30.
Unless there is any further business in fourth extraordinary session, we will now recess fourth extraordinary session and continue with our regular session. Fourth extraordinary session is recessed under call of the Speaker. We're back in regular session. All remaining items on our file are being continued, but we do have a request to adjourn in memory today by Mr. Garrick. So, members, if you could please direct your attention to Mr. Garrick for an adjourn in memory. Mr. Garrick, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Ladies, gentlemen, I rise today with a heavy heart to adjourn in memory of a good friend and longtime San Diegan, Herbert G. Klein. He was born in Los Angeles in 1918. Herb graduated from Theodore Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights and went to USC. While at USC, Herb began honing his newspaper or journalistic skills as the sports editor for the Daily Trojan. USC is also where he met his wife, who he married in 1941, and was married to her for 66 years till you heard me last year give a adjourn in memory of her, Marjorie. So great was his love for the University of Southern California that Klein continued his involvement with the school well after graduation and served as the past president of the General Alumni Association and was a USC Life trustee. This led to a decade-long career in journalism and communication and politics. In 1941, Herb began his newspaper career as a copy boy with the California Post-Advocate in Alhambra. A year later, Klein took a 4-year absence and served in the Navy, doing the public affairs officer work in the Pacific, working again with my father. Mr. Klein worked with newspaper organizations, was often interrupted by political events. Most notably, I think all of you will recognize that Klein worked as the press secretary for Richard Nixon, which included all of his campaigns, including his first congressional race in '46, his second one in '48, his Senate race in 1950, his vice presidential races of 52 and 56, his presidential race of 60, his governor's race of 62, and the presidential race successful of 1968. Klein would go on to serve in the White House and actually invented the term communications director, a position that he held for the first 4 years of the Nixon administration before he left in 1973. Mr. Klein was also a mentor to many of us. Congressman Kemp is one, Pete Wilson is another, myself, and my colleague Nathan Fletcher are just a few of the individuals that he mentored throughout his career. Mr. Klein is perhaps best known in San Diego area for his work with the Copley newspapers, though, and the San Diego Union-Tribune. In total, Mr. Klein worked for the Copley newspapers off and on for a total of over 50 years, rising to the title of editor-in-chief in 1980 and serving till 2003 when he retired. Aside from his newspaper work, Mr. Klein was also very influential in the San Diego community, particularly expressing that influence and his dedication and time and his love of sports. Mr. Klein attended over 35 Super Bowls, including the first one, and was a key member of the committee that helped bring 3 of those Super Bowls, the 1988, 1998, and 2003 Super Bowl to San Diego. He also helped found the Holiday Bowl. Members, I could stand here and go on for hours and hours about my good friend Herb Klein. He was more than a newspaper man and a politician. He was really a member of my family. I had the privilege of knowing him, and he attended my wedding. I've known him my entire life. He was always there when I called on him. His wealth of experience, his knowledge, his wisdom was there just at the asking. Mr. Klein and my father attended USC together and later joined the Navy, and their parallel careers carried them through 65 years of friendship, culminating with Herb giving one of the giving the eulogy and writing part of my father's obituary for the San Diego Union. I will always have a special place in my heart for Herb Klein. I know that he is smiling down on us today. He was a great husband, a father, a friend, a businessman, a community leader. In other words, he was a true American gentleman. I ask to adjourn in memory.
Thank you, Mr. Garrick. Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, as was just noted, San Diego lost an icon. California lost an icon. For many of us, we lost a friend. We lost a mentor, a constituent, someone who was a great source of encouragement, of advice and counsel. When I decided to enter the political arena, Herb Klein was one of the first folks I sat down with to talk about it. He gave me advice. He gave me guidance. He had had a long history, as was noted. He was a journalist. He was a political professional. He was an author of a book called Making It Perfectly Clear. He was a phenomenal, passionate Trojan. I'll never forget it as his 90th birthday, watching his face absolutely light up as the surprise present came marching in. The USC marching band had come from LA to San Diego to play Happy Birthday for Herb Klein. He was full of great stories. He would tell you the story of 1962, the meltdown is what he called it. Richard Nixon's absolute collapse in a press conference. And if you ever hear the audio at the beginning, you'll hear him referring to Mr. Klein, who was standing right there beside him. He would tell the story in 1959 of going with Nixon, then vice president, to Russia and the meetings with Khrushchev. In 1960, Herb was a part of organizing the first televised political debate in history. I'll never forget him telling the story after the 1960 election of being in Florida with Richard Nixon. In the aftermath of the election, the phone rang where they were staying, and he picked up the phone and said, "Hello?" The gentleman on the other line said, "This is Jack Kennedy. Can I speak to Mr. Nixon?" Herb shuttled over to Nixon and said, "Mr. Kennedy would like to speak to you," and Nixon replied in a manner that made it clear he didn't wish to speak to Mr. Kennedy. Herb Klein went back to the phone and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. President-elect, Mr. Nixon doesn't want to speak to you," at which point Mr. Kennedy said, "Herb, it's really important. I really need to talk to him." and this proceeded over days and days. Herb Klein was a man who lived history. He made history. He had a front row seat to so many defining moments in our country's history. But he carried on that legacy, not just being a part of it, but by helping pass that on to future generations and hope that they may learn the lessons. Herb Nixon was described, to paraphrase, by Time magazine after he left the Nixon administration preceding the Watergate scandal as someone who was an oasis of consideration and sympathy in what is often a frigid and cutthroat political environment. Herb Klein is someone throughout his career that maintained his dignity, he maintained his honor, he maintained his relationships. He was someone who has a legacy that we will never match. But if we strive, if we try and conduct ourselves in the manner and example he gave, then we can have a testament not only to his legacy, but to the greatness of all that he sought to achieve in his life. So it is with a sad and heavy heart that many of us join in a celebration of a life of 91 years. I saw him about a week or so before his passing, and although he was physically weak, he was mentally strong. We walked through a history of obscure vice presidential candidates, and he assessed the strengths and weaknesses of each and every one of them. We turned to the problems of Sacramento, and he gave me great encouragement, great hope, great belief that a state as great as California can tackle any challenge and any problem it faces and come out stronger. So I join with my colleagues from San Diego and from all over California and friends and family across America as we remember a truly amazing, amazing individual and someone we'll never forget, Herb Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Members, I'm checking on the schedule for floor session this week, and before we go on to adjournment, I did have a request to go back to our third reading. Mr. Fong would like to take up file item 79. It's a resolution, so I will have the clerk please read file item 79.
Assembly concur in Resolution 42 by Assemblymember Fong and others relative to Chinese Americans in California.
You may open, Mr. Fong.
Madam Speaker and members, California is an academic and cultural powerhouse known around the world, and it is the diversity of our state that has played a key role in California's success. However, behind the many accomplishments, California has a shadow of shame, which many have attempted to forget. ACR 42 aims to right the wrongs of our past. During the 19th and 20th century, California enacted some of the most discriminatory laws and constitutional provisions directly persecuting Chinese Americans living in California and the incoming Chinese immigrants. Our legislature denied Chinese Americans the right to own property, work, testify in court, marry persons of their choosing, and attend public schools. It was our California government that pushed Congress to adopt the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first federal law ever passed barring a group of immigrants solely on the basis of race or nationality, a law that directly impacted my family. However, despite the many barriers placed upon them by our government, Chinese Americans in California have made vast contributions to the state. They constructed most of the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad, helped build our Delta levees, assisted in the success of our fishing and agriculture industries, making California the great state it is today. ACR 42 seeks to recognize and apologize on behalf of the California State Legislature for the many discriminatory laws and constitutional provisions that our state enacted, as well as acknowledge the contributions Chinese Americans have made to our state. This resolution marks the first formal apology offered to the Chinese American community and will serve as a reminder of our wrongdoing. Learning from our past and acknowledging the injustice our history holds will help us build a stronger state. I respectfully request your aye vote. And I wanted to thank my co-sponsor, Kevin DeLeon, for bringing this idea up and introducing the idea to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fong. Mr. DeLeon.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I also do want to thank Mr. Paul Fong. Members, Madam Speaker, I also rise in support of ACR 42. I represent Chinatown in the city of Los Angeles, and I am a proud member of CSCA, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, for the past 6 years. The state of California owes a great deal of gratitude to Chinese Californians who have achieved incredible feats of labor and made great sacrifices to help build and strengthen our state. One of the reasons I believe the ACR 42 is so important is that the vast majority of Californians are completely unaware that it was our state, the state of California, that was instrumental in the passage of the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act, an act which set the precedent for the xenophobic national policies that would tear our nation apart for most of the 20th century. These discriminatory laws were enacted in order to impose shame and humiliation on Chinese Americans here in California, and they were designed to do one thing only. After the gold rush was done, after the railroads were constructed and built, it was to chase them out of the state of California. And this is how we paid them back: for building our railroads, for recovering our Tule swamps, for building our Delta levees, for building our irrigation systems, and for harvesting the fruits and vegetables of California's agricultural industry. Part of our history in the state of California are two California senators, former California Senator James T. Farley, as well as Mr. John Miller, were the two individuals instrumental at the federal level in Washington, D.C. to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. It is very important that this resolution come forward. Apologies are very important because they're not necessarily about changing the past, but they're about improving our future. This is a very good resolution that I'm humbled and proud to be part of, which acknowledges and apologizes for and expresses with much regret the many discriminatory laws and actions that this state has enacted against Chinese Americans. I thank Mr. Fong for authoring this measure, and this is a very good measure for all individuals, regardless of political parties, to support. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. De Leon. Before Mr. Fong closes, Mr. Gaines has his mic up. Mr. Gaines, do you wish to be recognized on the resolution?
Yes, thank you. Madam Speaker, we are in opposition to this resolution, and I request a roll call vote. Thank you.
Well, I think Mr. Fong, Mr. Swanson?
Yeah, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this resolution. California's strength is its diversity. This resolution is very much in order, and I encourage all my colleagues to support ACR 42. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Mr. Gaines is getting some clarification, I think. But I'll allow Mr. Fong to... Mr. Nielsen.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, I'd like to lend bipartisanship to this. I am very acutely aware of the contribution of the Chinese Americans into the history of this fine state, to the history of the nation. And I'm not one for apologizing. I think we should become less of a nation that apologizes. But in terms of the Chinese Americans and their contribution, indeed, they do deserve the apology. And I look at the apology just, if anything, as a making of amends and really an elevation of the acknowledgement of the marvelous contributions of Chinese to the history of the United States, and very particularly to the history of California. My colleague, Senator De Leon, spoke to the things that they've done in agriculture, and I've toured the museums, I've toured the mines and seen the risk they put their lives to climbing up those walls and bringing the rocks down in the mining. It's an incredible contribution. They're worthy of our acknowledgement. I urge an aye vote.
Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to commend the author, the co-authors, everyone involved in this important measure. I'd like to rise in support of this. I feel it's an appropriate thing for us to do today, and would urge all of my colleagues to consider supporting this measure. Thank you.
Mr. Torrico.
Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to allow Mr. Gaines to clarify his earlier statement. He's requested that. I don't see any reason to object.
Seeing no objection, Mr. Gaines, normally we do recognize a member once on an issue, but please proceed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I was in error. I was looking at some incorrect information, and so if you could please disregard what I had said, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines. So we'll take that as you being in support of the resolution then? Point of clarification. Thank you for that. Mr. Fong, seeing no further discussion on this, you may close.
With that, I respectfully request an aye vote. The first roll call for co-authors.
Very well, members. First roll call will be for co-authors on this resolution. Clerk will open the roll. This is for co-authors, members. First roll is for co-authors. First roll is for co-authors on the resolution. Clerk will close the roll. We have 71 co-authors. And we can adopt this on a voice vote. All those in favor of adopting the resolution signify by the usual sound of aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. Mr. Torrico.
Madam Speaker, if we could return to motion resolutions, please. I request unanimous consent to waive the file notice requirements to allow the local government committee to hear SB 43 on Wednesday, July 8, 2009 at 1:30 p.m.
Mr. Gaines?
Yes, Madam Speaker, this is the bill that I wanted to let our colleagues know that we are in opposition to and would request a roll call vote. Thank
You're
you.
withholding unanimous consent on this, on waiving file notice requirements? All right. We will do a roll call vote on this motion then. Clerk, Mr. Tirico is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gaines for a no vote. Clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. Mr. Tirico is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gaines for a no vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. Ayes 45, noes 26. The motion carries. The rule waiver is granted. Our schedule for floor session is as follows. Tomorrow, Tuesday, July 7th, check-in session and floor session upon call of the Speaker. Wednesday, July 8th, check-in session and floor session upon call of the Speaker. Thursday, July 9th, floor session at 9:30 a.m. Is there any further business to come before this House? Seeing and hearing none, a motion to adjourn is in order. Mr. Krikorian moves, Mr. Gaines seconds. That this House stands adjourned. All in favor signify by the usual sound of aye. The ayes have it. Quorum call is lifted. The House is adjourned.